Hey guys, what's up? This is a dual upload, so this is going to be going up on Team Saki's channel. I know a lot of you probably aren't all that familiar with me. I did do an upload on their channel. I did an Eel Zone deck profile. I help out with them sometimes on Pokemon stuff. And then for you all coming from my channel, which is significantly less people, I will leave a link in the D-Box to Team Saki's channel. They're pretty cool. They do Yu-Gi-Oh stuff. They do some Pokemon. I even think they did a Vanguard box opening just recently, so they've got a lot of cool stuff going on. They're really good, so go check them out. Hopefully they'll put a link in the D-Box to my channel. If not, Pokebro921, it should be my logo in the bottom, so go sub to me too. I need subscribers. You guys help me out. But anyways, let's get into the deck profile. You couldn't tell by the intro, we're talking about Mewtwo Celebi Tornadus. So, I don't think I'm shocking anyone when I say that the Heart Gold Soul Silver Triumphant Edition had the best Prime cards out of any of the Heart Gold Soul Silver sets. It had Gengar Prime, who, although he flopped, had more hype than just about any card ever. It had Machamp Prime, who saw play in Vileplume Machamp and Donchamp. It had Mew Prime, who saw playing decks like Mewgar, Mewlock, and Mewbox. Yanmega, who at one point was the most expensive card in the format. He also saw play in decks like Stage 1 Rush, Mewlock, and of course Yanmega Magnezone. Magnezone himself, who has been probably the best card in the format since Heart Gold Silver on rotation, playing in decks like Magnarock, Yanmega Magnezone, and most recently Eel Zone. Electrode Prime, who's seen play in decks like Coke and Cake, whichever one you want to call that deck. And even Absol Prime has seen play as a tech in Six Corners decks to try and beat out Chandelure. So Celebi has kind of been, till this point, the odd man out. So what exactly has changed? His attack, Time Circle, is still bad. It costs 3 energy, a Grass and Psychic, so you have multi-typing energy, which is not good in this format and hasn't been good since rotation. And it only does 30 damage, which is pretty pitiful for 3 energy. And its side effect is mediocre, being able to block out Stage 1s and Stage 2s in a format where Free Retreat and Switch are both pretty common. His power has always been his saving grace. It allows you to attach an extra Grass energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon, so you get 2 attachments. One of them has to be Grass, though. But this power has never been really able to live up to its full potential, because if you wanted to retreat the same turn you use Celebi's Sky Arrow Bridge, you're essentially using one of those energies to retreat, so you're essentially just discarding an energy from your hand to have Celebi active for the beginning portion of your turn, because the 2 cancel out the attachment and the retreating. So, up until now, the only card that really countered Celebi's 1 retreat cost and got around burning your extra energy attachment to get Celebi back onto your bench was Switch, but you'd have to play a Switch every time you wanted to do this. Not really an effective means of getting a Celebi engine to work. However, with the release of Next Destinies, we got a new stadium card, Sky Arrow Bridge, which gives all basic Pokemon 1 less retreat cost, giving Celebi free retreat. This means that the Celebi engine now finally functions, and the only problem with the engine is that it works on Grass energy, which Grass has not been really one of the best types. The most played Grass card, Yanmega Prime, has never needed energy because of his Pokebody, so really, aside from Jumpluff, not really much has used Grass energy. I guess Virizion too. But there are a couple of really nice Pokemon that don't really need a specific energy typing, and it's those Pokemon that really abuse this engine very well. One of these Pokemon, and the most hyped Pokemon to do this, is Mewtwo EX. Mewtwo EX has an attack X-Ball, his pretty much the only attack you care about. His second attack is okay, but not really important because Psychic Energy is kind of hard to front and recycle, and Mewtwo's pretty easy to knock out. But X-Ball does 20 times the number of energy attached to each active Pokemon. So with Grass energies and double colorless energies, you're able to put the pressure on really early, and in the late game you're able to hit back cards that have a lot of energy attached to them very effectively. Mewtwo also really defines this format in that Mewtwo is very splashable and counters himself, so you can, most importantly, knock out your opponent's Mewtwo with your Mewtwo, and then they'll probably knock out your Mewtwo with their Mewtwo, and then you knock out their Mewtwo with your Mewtwo, and then at some point you win. But so this is one of the reasons why this engine is very effective. The other card that most lists are playing is Tornadus from Emerging Powers. Tornadus has been really nice since his release. The 80 damage is pretty nice, and he abuses double colorless energy, so he's easy to get going and does have the turn 1 donk potential, as does Mewtwo. He also keeps energy on the board by moving it around and keeping it off of himself, so even if you knock out Tornadus, you don't knock off all the energy on the field because he had moved it around with the side effect of Hurricane. His 110 HP is pretty nice for a basic, and his resistance to fighting is very, very useful. However, he is weak to lightning, one of the most popular types in the game. He also gets free retreat with Sky Arrow Bridge, so he's definitely another nice card to work with in this deck. So before we get into actual lists, it's important to explain that when you're looking at these lists, that there are two different schools of thought on how to play this deck. There's the consistency build, which focuses more on using Mewtwo and maybe Tornadus to get turn 1 attacks more frequently and apply more early game pressure, and then take catcher prizes to get your last few prizes, or trade off in a Mewtwo exchange, which when you have a prize lead is actually pretty favorable if you can keep up. The other build, the tech build, seeks to more set up slightly and be able to exchange prizes more evenly, and uses counters to basically some of the big metagame threats that just Tornadus and Mewtwo themselves can't deal with, like Reshiram, Zekrom EX, Thundurus, and Magnezone Prime. So first, let's look at the consistency builds. The first one I'm going to throw at you guys is the list that David B., the European Challenge Cup champion, used himself. The things that jump out at me at first are the fact that he is running a big number of draw supporters. The 12 draw supporters and the 3 poke gear is just crazy strong draw support. Also, those gears will not grab search cards for Pokemon because he is running Dual Ball, which is another thing that suggests that he's running a speed deck. It's interesting that he runs a 4-4 or a 4-2 split between Tornadus and Mewtwo, just because you think that usually for these speed, more Mewtwo heavy decks that you'd see probably a Mewtwo count of about 3. But, you know, apparently David didn't need it. He doesn't really run any recovery either, so it's an interesting list, but it definitely focuses on putting that pressure on early. We see 4 catcher and 4 junk arm to reuse those catchers is definitely a really strong list, and I suggest you guys test this one. The other list, this one, is Essa's from the deck out. I'll put his link in the D-box. It seems strange, but Essa's a really good player who, from my understanding, is top cut at multiple worlds, and stuff like that. So, you know, obviously there's, you know, something to back up this list. The first thing that jumps out at me is that he's running 7 Pokemon, and he's not playing Durant. He's running 3 Mewtwo EXs as only attackers. This is really interesting. Other things that stand out to me is the huge draw support once again. He also runs kind of a variety of supporters, which is interesting, seeing some copycats in there. The thought being that you're probably going to be ditching your entire hand, and maybe your opponent, you know, will have a bigger hand. He also runs a dual ball collector split, which is really interesting, so he will be able to hit collectors with those gears to search out Pokemon more consistently. Other things that stand out to me is that he has a slightly thicker energy line. The 10 grass really is a lot of grass energy to be running. 14 energy is pretty big in a deck, and especially that deck. The other thing that really stood out to me was the plus power count at 3. That's a pretty high count to deal that extra 10 damage, but it is important just for getting over certain humps, like having 2 energy on each Mewtwo and trying to one-shot a Mewtwo EX. That's going to be vital. Hitting some other stuff. So they're both really interesting lists. So before I talk about the tech list, it's important to talk about these 4 Pokemon that I just mentioned earlier: Tornadus, Magnezone Prime, Zekrom EX, and Reshiram. And why these 4 are a threat to the straight consistency build. If you look, all of them actually discard energy, or in Magnezone's case, Lost Burn, so Lost Zone energy. So they're getting energy off of the Pokemon that's attacking. This is problematic for Mewtwo because his damage output is based on the energy attached to both Pokemon, which makes it difficult for him to one-shot these Pokemon. Additionally, two of these Pokemon don't require that much setup, especially Thundurus, which is a really good early game card for Eel variants, can really do some damage to this list. The other side of the coin, Tornadus, and Tornadus' inability to handle these 4 cards, 3 of them lie in the fact that they are lightning Pokemon and Tornadus is lightning weak. This is especially true of the relationship between the 2 genies. Thundurus is just as fast as Tornadus in most situations and can one-shot Thundurus, or Thundurus can one-shot Tornadus. Tornadus cannot one-shot Thundurus, save a triple plus power, which doesn't happen too often. Additionally, the others can also knock him out. Reshiram can't knock him out if he has an Eviolite attached, but even then he's only a plus power shy of doing so. So using those 2 Pokemon alone, it's really difficult to deal with these 4 threats, which would be played in Eel variants and Reshiram Typhlosion, which is still likely to be a fairly prevalent deck, if not a successful deck in the metagame. So thinking about the cards that deal with these 4 Pokemon, the first one that comes to mind is Terrakion from Noble Victories. Terrakion just basically beats down on lightning Pokemon and all fighting weak Pokemon. He is compatible with Grass Energy to fulfill the colorless requirement of his attack Revenge, which does 90 if one of your Pokemon was knocked out the previous turn. So if you play him, you have to incorporate either Fighting or Prism. I recommend just Fighting if you're not playing anything else because it's not susceptible to Loss Remover. This deck works really well with Terrakion though because you can drop a Terrakion out of nowhere, which is really Terrakion's only downfall has been his retreat cost so far. So Terrakion is really nice for knocking out Magnezone Primes, Zekrom EXs, who even if they have an Eviolite is only a plus power shy of being one-shot by a non-EX Pokemon, and you get to take 2 prizes. The only Pokemon Terrakion doesn't really deal with is Reshiram, but he still would help the matchup. He's not one-shot, and if you can get the extra fighting energy down on him, his Land Crush attack can still continue to do damage to Typhlosion. And even if you can't, your Revenge attack used a second time will probably still knock out a Reshiram that's taken enough damage. Another tech that helps really well with Reshiram and then Reshiram EX as well, and really Zekrom EX, and pretty much almost everything other than Terrakion and Magnezone it's good against, is Regigigas EX. Regigigas EX basically has a first attack that's similar to Tornadus, so he can help you in applying early game pressure, which is great. His second attack is basically like Outrage on steroids. Instead of having the 20 base, it has a 50 base, and instead of having 130 HP, this guy has 180 HP. So he can really do serious damage. None of the other EXs really stand to one-shot him except for Mewtwo with a ton of energies, which is, again, a very vulnerable card against this deck. So Regigigas is really nice. He helps out with Reshiram. You can also catch her potentially after a Blue Flare and take a Typhlosion rather than a Reshiram, which really helps your board control and makes him a really good card. 2 of the other techs, one of which we saw in David B's list that I didn't mention, is Shaman from Unleashed. Shaman lets you rearrange all your energy on the field, and that can be really helpful with Mewtwo, so you don't have to make a Mewtwo vulnerable by having a lot of energy on it, and you can pretty much just surprise your opponent with the Mewtwo and take some big KOs there. The other Shaman, Shaman EX, is actually pretty good in this deck too as your late game sweeper. The one downfall of this deck is that it doesn't have the biggest output damage unless you stack a ton of energy on Mewtwo, which, as I've said several times, makes him very vulnerable. Shaman EX does 30 plus 30 more for every prize card your opponent's taken. So if your opponent is down to a single prize card, this guy's hitting for 180 damage for 2 energy, which is powered by your Celebi's attack and runs on grass energy anyway. So the thought is really pretty much, why not run him? So he's another very effective attacker. His only downside is that if you start with him, he has 110 HP and is worth 2 prize cards, which can really hurt you if you lead with him. So a lot of people play super scoop ups to supplement switches if they decide to run him. So you can basically pick him up from the active spot and put him into your hand and wait to use him until you really need him. Some other techs that I've seen in this deck that work pretty well are Smeargle to use his Portrait ability to boost consistency and work as another lead. Virizion from Noble Victories kind of works and does the same role as Tornadus, but has double draw and can Leaf Wallop more consistently than Tornadus can Hurricane turn 1. Victini or Benchtini is a counter to Durant that I've seen, although if you run it with Prism Energy, you're just going to get Lost Remover, so you'd probably have to run Basic Fire, and you'd also have to keep a full bench, which can be a pain in the butt, even with Sky Arrow Bridge against a Durant. And lastly, Lost Remover. Even though you're playing a deck that wants your opponent to have a lot of energy, in certain situations you want to take away your opponent's special energies, and Lost Remover can be really effective in slowing down your opponent and taking away their board control. So now that we've looked at all these different techs, I'm going to put a list up for you guys that is my own personal list that I've played with. It's not the list I'm currently playing, but I do stand by it as a solid list, and basically a nice counter to all the eel variants that are going around. If you look at it, it's fairly similar to the other two lists in a couple respects. It's running maxed out Celebi for starts and a high Tornadus count with 2 Mewtwo. Not anything too out of the ordinary. It also runs a Shaman, which isn't a crazy uncommon tech. That's the Shaman Unleashed, not the Shaman EX. The card that really stands out from the Pokemon standpoint is the 2 Terrakion. Terrakion is specifically there to counter eel variants and take prizes, basically to put pressure on Zekrom EXs, take really favorable prize exchanges with them, and basically be your mid to late game attacker against eel decks. The other things to note are that this deck still runs a high number of draw supporters. It runs 11 of them, and then 3 collector, and 3 gear as well. It still keeps 4 junk arm and 4 catcher. The places where it suffers a little bit, I'm running a lower Sky Arrow Bridge count because I'm not as concerned with getting the turn 1 attack. I still want it, and I still run high switch and Sky Arrow counts for that reason, but I don't need it as much. I also run a lower plus power count. I do still have a Super Rod in here. And then my energy is also a little bit more spread out, in that I'm running fighting energy as well, which gives you a lower grass count, which hurts, but with Super Rod you can make up for it. So we're on the last leg of this video. Now I'm going to talk about the different matchups this deck has and kind of how they play out, but I'm not going to give percents or anything like that. The first matchup to address is the one against what was previously the best deck in format, Magnezone Electric. The matchup against this deck is pretty favorable in my opinion, even though your opponent can take the 2-to-1 prize exchange with Magnezone. They still have to set up Magnezones. You have a huge donk potential against this deck, especially with the consistency build based on how many small HP basics they have. Additionally, if you run Terrakion, you can pretty much just decimate Magnezones, and if you get and for every Terrakion that they can't immediately respond to, you put an immense amount of pressure on them with the threat of dropping a second fighting energy to Land Crush. So it's a pretty favorable matchup. I think I'm not going to give you numbers, but it's definitely in your favor. The next matchup to address is against the new alleged best deck in format, and one that I probably think this is the best deck in format for the most part, Zekrom Electric. And the matchup against that one really depends. It's going to be close pretty much no matter what. If you run a heavy Terrakion count and can still maintain consistency, it'll probably be a favorable matchup, but some of the more straight Mewtwo consistency decks, this is the matchup that they probably struggle on the most, and probably where really matchups hurt them the most, although they do have that really nice donk potential against Tynamo, and that should be factored in when you're considering this matchup, because it does happen a lot more than the Zekrom Electric player would like it to. The other matchup that's going to be really important is the matchup against Durant. Unfortunately for a lot of people, Durant is still around. I'm not personally a Durant hater, but I understand why it's frustrating for people. The Durant matchup is an unfavorable one, especially if you're running the tech variant. Starting with something like a Terrakion, your Shaman Unleashed, basically anything where you can't really get going turn 1 is pretty bad for you. Even Tornadus has his faults not being able to KO once they get down to Eviolites and the special metals. So, in my opinion, your best bet is to stack up energy on a Mewtwo. Even though they do resist, if they have an energy attached, that resistance cancels out. If you get about 5 energy on a Mewtwo, you're going to be able to basically just sweep. So it's really about getting that Celebi, and then hopefully the Sky Arrow Bridge down. Running higher counts, preferably 3 Sky Arrow Bridge, really makes a difference here, and that's one thing that the list I threw at you really has a shortcoming on, is that it does only run 2 Sky Arrow, so I suggest probably boosting that up to 3. That's one thing that I don't like about that list. It's probably my least favorite thing. I'd even sacrifice a Junk Arm or a Catcher for it. The other matchups that you're going to come across that I think are fairly relevant are the Reshiflosion matchup. That one is still, I think, even to probably favorable, just because they're running a setup deck, especially if you play Regigigas. Regigigas helps tremendously with this matchup and can take out a Typhlosion. You really have to pick up Cyndaquils and the catcher count, and hitting your catchers is the most important thing about this matchup. When they have 2 Typhlosion hit the field, it's going to be pretty tough, just because that deck can so consistently put out that 120 damage on the blue flare that you need to take out those Typhlosions before they become that big of a threat. The last matchup is the Truth matchup, which is actually kind of an interesting one in that usually you'd assume a speed deck would have trouble with Durant. If you're running just the straight 3 Mewtwo Essa build, I do think it's an unfavorable matchup simply because you don't have enough attackers to really recover under Trainer Lock. However, if you're running the speed build or even the tech build, I think the matchup becomes the speed build with Tornadus, that is, or the tech build. I think the matchup becomes favorable. If you can keep your Mewtwo's on the bench and take your early prizes with something like Tornadus, charge up those Mewtwo's and get a lot of energy on them, you can take out basically anything that they want to shield with and take some key prizes. Especially if you can draw out their Mewtwo, which I know a lot of Truth builds do, then you can easily KO that, and that's 2 prizes. Taking out their EX Pokemon if they're attacking with those is huge. I think a lot of variants will run Donphan still because Magnezone does obliterate the Truth otherwise. So the Donphan lines will probably be the worst thing for you simply because they're not worth a lot of prizes. Also, if you play Shaman EX, you can basically time your prizes and basically send up things as fodder to get yourself down to 1 prize, and also really helps in that matchup, surprisingly. So those are things to consider in that matchup. So across the board, it's got even to slightly favorable to slightly unfavorable matchups. I do think it's one of the best decks in format. I think it's one of the most consistent, one of the most fun decks. I'm really happy with the way the new format's turned out. I really think it's become a more skill-based format now, and so for those of you who aren't really, big into the format for Pokemon, people on Team Saki's channel who are really just Yu-Gi-Oh players, I really suggest that now is the time to check out Pokemon because there are a lot of really cool things going down. I'll leave some links. Hopefully they'll put some in the D-box. And thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to Team Saki, subscribe to me, and you've been great.